Can we see that? X is the necessary condition of Y. Y, therefore X. Now, granted, I know that no atheist is going to accept that when I plug in God or the preconditions or anything like that. But the structure of the argument is not, my argument is God exists, therefore God exists. Okay? Do you see that anywhere in that? Did I ever say, I know God exists because God exists. I presuppose God, therefore God exists. Do you see that in it? Is that the same as this? No, it's not. This is, there's nothing, it should be self-evident in a way. I don't believe in self-evident truth, but in a limited sense, right? It should be obvious to any reasonable person that this is not a fallacy. If X is a necessary condition of Y, and if Y is the case, then clearly, by necessity, X is the case. It's very simple. Okay, it's not rocket science. I know people get confused over transcendental arguments. They think this is some wild, obtuse, out there thing. It's actually really simple. What's Father Deacon's analogy he always makes? Cake, right? What are the necessary conditions of having a cake? Flour, eggs, sugar, icing. Okay? I have a cake. If I have a cake, then by necessity, I have the necessary conditions of cake. Flour, icing, eggs, milk, whatever. I don't know. Whatever makes a cake. I don't know. I don't need that soy Pillsbury Doughboy diet that old John Lennox is over there eating. Okay, I eat the carnivore diet. But if I did eat cakes, then by necessity, the cake would include the necessary elements of cake to have cakeness, namely flour, eggs, milk, sugar, etc., etc., etc. To quote Bernardo from West Side Story. So, do you guys see this? Because I just want a little minute to rant there about the bottom of the barrel IQ stuff going on in the atheist comment sections. Because there's probably at least 400 or 500 atheists in Matt Dillahunty's comment section on our debate and underneath my debate on my channel with him. They're literally saying, this guy thinks that saying God exists is the argument for God's existence. And they literally think that saying a transcendental argument is word salad. Okay, this is not word salad. This is very simple. So we're dealing with severely mentally incapacitated individuals, right? That's what we're dealing with here. And ultimately, remember, atheism isn't primarily an intellectual problem. Atheism is a spiritual problem, as many of the elders and fathers and saints say. Without soul, there is only darkness. If we are to believe there is a single cosmos, it must be that the cosmos is contained in some single soul. If there is a way of seeing things right, then there must be an intellect, and indeed that which contains and decrees right answers. But if there is no equivalent single soul, then the phenomenal world is always far astray. Our experience is always delusory and, by comparison, multiple and transient. If we are to believe not only that there are right answers, but that we can discover them, it must be possible for God himself, he says Zeus, he's speaking of the Greek view, to become incarnate, or for there to be someone somewhere who has the mind of God, and not just an ethereal abstract thing, but in his actual life within time and space. That's Christ. For Plotinus, the incarnation was the world soul herself in all reality, which is nonsense. At once our elder sister, Gnostic, and at the same time the fullest expression of soul herself. But maybe there has to be a more particularized embodiment, correct, and one that can be grasped from within this synthesis. That man is each man is a microcosm of the larger. And then he goes on to say that, well, we don't have this divine mind of ourselves. We get it through an incarnate God. So, when you understand that, when you read my essay, and when you read the argument that Stephen Clark is making, then what we see is that it's not just a question of numbers, but all of these other things that you could list that are, you can call them transcendentals or categories or preconditions. We'll call them transcendental preconditions. We're just going to list some. And somebody asked the other day, is there a perfect list of all of them? No. How could there be? Let's just look at a few, and we start to see that although on the surface this argument might seem really obscure, it's not. It's actually pretty, man, these lights just don't work with this. Okay, so let's take the first one. Time and space. Okay, now this is a transcendental category that you cannot empirically verify. And don't give me the low IQ reply of, well, I have a watch. Your watch is not the same thing as time itself. Time itself is some kind of abstract category. Doesn't matter what you want to define it as. Point is that it's not proven to exist merely by empirical investigation. Yes, I know it's a measurement. It's a measurement of the rate at which light travels or whatever. It doesn't matter. I don't care about how you define it. The point is that it's not defined or known merely by empirical investigation. But it's presupposed in the way humans interact in the world, right? We experience the world from beginning to middle to end. There's no human being on the face of the planet that experiences things in reverse, right? And we also experience and learn things within a spatial field, a visio-spatio-temporal field. That's how we learn things. There's not a human being on the planet who does it in a different way. We are beings constituted such that we learn things in a spatio-temporal field of vision, right? In the here and the now. Well, how do you prove that empirically? You can't. It's an assumed transcendental precondition of knowledge and experience. The self. You cannot empirically demonstrate that you have a self. It's presupposed in all actions of cognition, communication, noetic energies, ratiocinations, etc. There's no test tube, no microscope that's going to show you the self. That words have meaning and that they can convey meaning to other persons. It's another transcendental category. There's no empirical verification that you are transmitting the right meaning to another brain, another bunch of gray matter. It has to be assumed. The past. The past is a transcendental category that you cannot empirically prove exists or existed. It is assumed in the way that we as humans experience time and space and operate. Universals. Right? There's no empirical verification for universal categories, invariant concepts, numbers, etc., but that we know they exist. Ethics. Right? Where is the ethics under the rock? Where in the microscope? Where in the test tube are the ethics? They are nowhere there. So they are assumed. These are just examples of things that are, and again, you can come up with more. But these are examples of transcendental preconditions for the possibility of even having knowledge at all in this world and operating in this world. None of these things are proven or known by empirical investigation. Are they related to empirical investigation? Yes, but they are presupposed in empirical investigation, and they are not the immediate subject of any empirical proof or investigation. So does that mean we cannot know these things or prove these things? No. That's where the transcendental argument comes in, because it is an argument based on the denial of any of these things as leading to absurdity. So when we come to the question of God and God's existence and the mind of God and the mind of Christ, etc., that I just mentioned in the Stephen Clark paper that I cited in my paper, we can ask another question. How do these different things relate to one another? Because our experience of the world is not chopped up into only having spatio-temporal relations without a self, right? No, that would be nonsensical. Spatio-temporal experience assumes a self that's having the spatio-temporal experience. And when we speak or write words that have meaning to convey that meaning to another chunk of gray matter in somebody else's head. It assumes that they have a self. It assumes that these words and these meanings are entering into spatio-temporal relations to convey that meaning, becoming mediums for information being conveyed from one person to the next. What it is to be a self is partly bound up with the past. I'm not an abstract category. I'm not a platonic form. I'm not the number 7. I'm a person who has a past, a life that began at a point in time. Part of my past is partly what makes me up, and you and everybody else, right? So there's no neutral kind of, I don't know what it would even be, like some abstract neutral self that doesn't have experiences. That's impossible, right? Universals, universal categories, universal laws of logic, universal in terms of predicates. These are presupposed in speaking. So the point is that when you just take a little sampling here of these kinds of things that are not like material things, and you say, well, these don't operate on their own. They all work together. Yeah, exactly. So how do they work together if there's not a God that holds them all together? That's the argument. Because what Platonism at least shows, in the Platonic argument that Clark was interacting with, it can only go so far, and then it's terrible. It screws up at the key point, because they can point out some of these things, and then they say, oh, and the answer is just that it's all a number 1. It's all just the one, man. No, it's not. You need a mind, and the human mind is not enough to encapsulate and relate all of these things together in all of their different particulars in every different human being's life and existence. But if you believe in God the way that we speak about God, that's exactly what he does. He fulfills this precondition. He is the ultimate precondition for all the other preconditions. That's the argument. So I hope that's helpful. It does at first seem a little kind of abstract and, whoa, that's weird, what? But I think when you understand it, it's like, oh, wow, yeah. What else would it be? But nothing else even makes any sense if it's not God. I mean, it's not the human mind. The human mind can't do this stuff. No finite mind can do it. And the atheist can't even get past like why there's even needs to be a mind anyway. Because they don't even think they have a mind. As they sit there touting their own mental acumen, which they actually don't have. That's the great irony of that. But anyway. So I hope that's helpful for the transcendental argument question. Dalton, have you been sneaking out of Roadhouse? Have you been sneaking out of busting butts down at the Roadhouse, those drunk rednecks, and doing your Zen philosophy? And macking on Kelly Lynch, Dalton? Can you rip a dude's throat out, Dalton? If you don't know what I'm talking about, go watch Roadhouse.
My question is, I got several questions.
Okay.
I'll first start off is, I've heard you describe metaphysical principles as like these things that we use, these, I guess, not really ideas. Would they be ideas?
Well, I mean, ideas are a metaphysical principle, but there's a lot of different metaphysical principles.
And so and they're all connected, and they're like a string of pearls that's contained in the divine mind.
Well, I was talking about transcendental categories, which are presuppositions for the possibility, preconditions for the possibility of knowledge. So time and space, the self, abstract concepts, laws of logic. I mean, those are all examples of things that we can't directly empirically prove, causation, teleology, but they must be the case for there to be knowledge at all. Right,
and so okay, so
and they don't stand alone. They don't stand alone. They don't stand alone in a vacuum. So
yeah, right.
You
they
can't
have to be contained in the mind. In a
right.
Mind,
so they have to be grounded somewhere in a way in which they all sort of work in a synergistic way together. Because clearly causation is not identical to teleology or purpose. So they're distinct things, but they're also in a sense, have to be connected, because if we're theists, then the world has a cause, causation exists, and there's also purpose and an end for which the causes occur. So causation and teleology go together in the theistic worldview.
Right. So, okay, and I've heard you say that, this is, only possible in a Orthodox worldview, right?
Right, because a lot of
My question is why? Like, why could that not
because
be?
a
Like,
lot of
Islam,
positions.
why could they not argue?
Because when you look at all of these things working together, it necessitates a certain type of metaphysic, not just any metaphysic. And so it leads us to a Trinitarian metaphysic, the kind of God that we see in Orthodox Christianity that avoids the theological traps and problems of modal collapse, absolute divine simplicity, monism, dualism, etc. Those are all dead-end positions that the other theistic systems won't work. They don't suffice to ground the things that we're talking about.
All right.
Also, I would add to, Jay and I did, a stream on the Garby article, and this is really important too, is that you don't treat each religion just as kind of a ground up, or we just tack these different things, and this will work, like kind of bare minimum. But as Garby says, each philosophy and paradigm is equivalent to what we would call in analytic philosophy and philosophy of language and logic is truth conjunctions. So I'm not going to go too far into detail, but basically every religion or philosophy has a set of propositions about its beliefs, such that if you were to take any one of those out, it changes the whole truth about the conjunction of all those. And therefore, as part of like orthodoxy too, is that it is the fullness of truth and that there is no other. So it's basically saying this is true and all the others are false and does not provide a conditions for the possibility of knowledge. So now you have something in a disjunctive argument. It's either orthodoxy or it's not orthodoxy. Part of orthodoxy says that all the other ones are false. So for you to negate that orthodoxy is true or question that, what I show is that it ends up, you're going to be committed to something or believing something in order to negate one of those truth conditions of orthodoxy that will end up as a defeater for knowledge. That's just one of many arguments that we present. Jay just presented one too, that it's not, well, as long as I just get the Trinity, I don't know, like a Jesus that's incarnate and a Bible and divine revelation, that'll be enough. That's not enough. It's a whole system that includes, it's either the whole or it's not the whole. And if it's not the whole, in order to assert that, you'll be it's self-supplication. It would be a defeater for knowledge in order to assert that. So as Jay and I always say, from the impossibility of the contrary, orthodox, it only works in an orthodox position. Jay, I don't know if you want to say some more about that.
Yeah, let's look at some examples of things that are preconditions for the possibility of knowledge, right? We could look at the self. How do we speak about knowledge without a knower, right? Doesn't it seem to necessitate some even though I can't perfectly define it, what a self is or what a knower is? I mean, to talk about knowledge assumes that there's some being or agent who has agency to know, to will not to know, or to have intentionality. So I'm going to say that any action of knowledge is assuming or presupposing a self, agency, or intentionality. Knowing for humans, I think you could argue requires some conception of space-time. I may not know exactly how space-time works, but humans are constituted such that they learn things in space-time in a beginning, middle, end sequence. Right. So I think space-time is a precondition of knowledge. I think that unity and diversity are categories that are necessary for the preconditions of knowledge, right? Picking out something amongst a class of things, or I could have used one and many, or I could have used genera, species, particular, etc. I think identity over time is an example. Causation and teleology are examples. The laws of logic. You could look at the notion of abstract concepts and meaning. All of these things are examples of things. You could list more, but these are examples of things that any action, any possible action of knowing, any knowledge event requires these types of things. These things are not under the immediate purview of the action of knowledge, right? So for me to say that the tree outside my office is green, even though I'm not studying these things on my whiteboard here, these things on the whiteboard already have to be the case as preconditions for me to be able to say something like the tree is green and for that to be actually the case, right? So we're gonna say that, assuming for the sake of argument that is the case, just as a test example of some knowledge event, right? Some predication event, the possibility of predication, right? These things, at least, and many other things probably that you could flesh out, would have to be the case to be able to say the tree is green. These are preconditions, and they're prior to any evidentialist type of knowledge. That's why we keep stressing this against evidentialists, is that I'm not going to grant to the atheist his evidentialist claims about this or that thing when he hasn't accounted for these things, which are necessary for evidential claims at all, you see. Yeah. Now, when I look at these things, it doesn't work for me to say, okay, well, I agree with all these things. Here's the Matt Dillahunty approach. See, all these, they just are. Okay, they just are. That's not a good answer as to, wait a minute. So now you're basically admitting the world is highly structured, such that these metaphysical principles now are the case, Matt Dillahunty. But you told me in your argumentation that you shouldn't believe in anything without empirical proof or evidence. There is no empirical proof or evidence for these principles themselves.
Right.
That's Hume's argument, right? So the question then is, how do all of these things work together? Even Fazer admits that these preconditions, these transcendental categories, they don't just stand on their own. They all kind of have to work together, right? Causation and teleology, they kind of work together. Abstract concepts, they kind of need a mind, right? So my argument is that if you bundle all these together and see how they all kind of synergize, this is actually a very powerful, it's almost like a fine-tuning argument applied to preconditions of knowledge.
Right? It's a beautiful argument. I just having a hard time grasping it. I don't, it's just, I'm not used to thinking in such an abstract way as that. And so my original question wasn't, and you and Father Deacon have starting to answer.
Well, let's use Father Deacon's classic example of cake, right?
Well, I was going to say, like, I understand these principles have to be contained in the mind. My question was, well, why couldn't the false Muslim God? Why couldn't that be the mind that is contained in? That was my question. Like, that's what I.
Right. So when we get into doctrines like Islam, if you go listen to my Muslim debates, that's when that's when absolute divine simplicity becomes a problem, because they start reducing God to being one thing, and even though they'll say things like, "Well, Allah has 99 names," it really becomes unclear as to how there's real distinctions in Allah. Right, but so Allah can have 99 names and they can be really distinct, but we're polytheists because we say that God's a triad. You see how it starts to be arbitrary. But also, apart from that question, what I kept trying to drill down in the debate with Azrar Rashid was about, well, do you think that the divine ideas or the pattern or whatever in the divine mind, do you think that they're identical to Allah as well? Are they also the essence or substance of Allah? And that, in other words, if they don't have the essence energy distinction, that's going to be a problem. But even if they do, if they were somehow able to admit some kind of distinction between essence and energy, it's really not consistent with the rest of the Islamic metaphysics. So I would go into other areas like their occasionalism to refute, the Islamic view, and also a bare Unitarian view, as we've shown in many live streams, really doesn't work, because is Allah always, is he eternally provident? If he's eternally provident, then there's an eternal creation over which he's provident, but they don't believe the creation is eternal.
That's origin, right?
It would lead to originism. That's why,
right.
Exactly.
And so, and we're the only, I'm Orthodox Christian. We're the only church that has essence energy. Like even Catholics reject that, right?
Correct.
And then you can't, I think I heard you talk about this. Palamas says that you cannot know God because all you would know is just created manifestations. You cannot, if there's no essence energy.
Right. So it depends on what the opponent says. There's one point where Barlium makes the argument, and he later contradicts himself, but there's one point in the dialogue where Barlium says, oh, well, you don't actually know God directly. You just know created effects. And Palamas says, okay, well, then if we're always only knowing created effects, then we never actually know if we're knowing God's mercy, God's love, God's justice, or any. It's just created effects. Yeah. So we never know God himself, which undercuts the incarnation because it's so stupid.
Yeah, it is. I don't understand how, and I've heard you debate Thomas about this. How could anybody say that the transfiguration was created grace? I don't understand that.
Thus the slow boy nature of their exactly. I mean, how do you say it's just ridiculous?
Absurd, man.
Well, that's how they rescue the system. They will go anywhere to rescue the system because they know if they can see that it's not, then it's pretty much over for Thomism.
Okay. One more question, Jay, and I'm gonna move on. Let
somebody
else talk.
Sure.
So I was listening to your Sam Harris critique the other day, and he kept talking about, Sam Harris keeps bringing up this whole there's a brute facts. There's just a brute fact. This is a brute fact.
Right.
And you say that there's no brute fact.
Right.
Now I'm just trying to work this out in my head. So, okay, if I assume there's a self, okay, and I say that's a brute fact, and you, of course, you would say it's not, right? It's not a brute fact to say that I'm a self, I'm an individual, some kind of conscious being of some sort.
Mm-hmm.
That's not self-evident, or is it not? Or is it?
Well, no, I mean,
my question is, how is it not? Like, if I am able to empirical sense data, like if I go touch a chair and I can feel the wood and I can look at the legs, I'm seeing with my eyes. How is that not saying that I'm empirically sense dating this object? So therefore, the self has to be a brute fact. Like, I don't.
Because there's no such, because you're assuming all of these things that have not yet been proven. So remember, a brute fact is. But
I can see it though. Like.
That's begging the question. Hold on. Let's take some examples, and Father Deacon's really good on this too, so I'll let him speak in a second. But I mean, you're assuming that you're seeing something like this occur. So you are receiving sense data impressions from an external object, but this event itself does not tell you that there's a meaningful external world with this meaningful object that is imprinting causally this sense data upon you. You're just assuming that there's an event occurring. There's a sense data occurring, and you are interpreting it as the chair in the external world that is causing that. That's an invalid leap that you can't justify.
Okay, well, how does that not lead to this Buddhist, Hindu, everything's an illusion?
No, I'm not. You're confusing the argument with adopting the whole position. I'm just making the point against a foundationalist epistemology that David Hume would make. That doesn't mean I'm adopting David Hume's skepticism. The point is that there's no justification for that view given the empiricist starting point. In other words, you want to be an empiricist. You want to. That's what you're. See, a lot of people don't understand that when you have this view, you got to take the empiricist system as a whole. You can't make
and
these.
Furthermore,
and that's what Hume did, right?
Yeah.
And furthermore, what brute fact means and self-evident has a very specific meaning. So we're not just using this kind of colloquially.
Right.
What, as Jay had pointed out, it's just a scene. You just see it as there's no need for explanation. But as Kant and the followers of Kant, Strauss and Sellers point out, there is no scenes. There's always a scene as, according to concepts and paradigms and all these different things. And so we really need to kind of unpack what these words, brute fact, means and self-evident principles. So, as I argue, a self-evident principle is a principle that, just in case it is true, and if adequately understanding it's enough to make you justified in believing it. So that's kind of like what the definition of a self-evident proposition, fact, phenomenon, etc. So I'll just repeat. a claim is said to be self-evident or phenomenon just in case it's true, and adequately understanding it is enough to make you justified in believing it. Now, let's go to the first problem. It begs the question, how do we know that claim's true? Well, just grant me my assumption so I can give you my definition that supports my whole position. No, that's not going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Second, the notion of what constitutes adequate understanding, which is in part of the definition of a self-evident principle, is something that's too ambiguous or vague. On whose adequate understanding? And you'll see this across the board with philosophers. Any rational person that any adequate understanding, right? And of course, it's all couched in terms of their philosophy and what Kant or Hegel or Berkeley would say, right? So it's disingenuous. They pretend like, well, we all mean the same thing by understanding, adequate understanding, true, but it's not at all. And that too begs the question, wait a minute. How do we even suppose I wasn't ambiguous about what it means to be adequate understanding. Aren't I getting ahead of myself epistemologically? I mean, I'm already granting that understanding exists without me being able to actually show that I've obtained the criteria for what counts as understanding before I've done it. So it's begging the question. In other words, it seems what it actually wants to prove. And the third idea, the third critique of brute facts or self-evident principles is in that notion. Remember I said, in case it's true and adequately understanding what the phenomena is or the propositions enough to make you justify in believing it. Well, here you have the term enough, which is a sufficient condition to make one justified in holding that belief. That's simply false. That's not enough. That's based on an erroneous and false assumption, as Jade pointed out, by classical foundationalism or any variety of foundationalism that has this kind of correspondence theory that, well, our propositions or our seemings, or as you said, like the sensing out there, they just have their meaning. They just are what they are in isolation from the rest of our propositions, beliefs, paradigms, and theories. In other words, it's the position that's asserted that our theories and other ideas don't contaminate our propositions, beliefs, and seemings and appearance. And that's just patently false. So I think it's a good analysis of what, brute facts and self-evident propositions are, and then a threefold critique of those, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I still got to work some things out, but I feel like I'm getting it. And Jay, I appreciate your patience with me, and thank you, Father Deacon.
Yeah, let's look at another way to argue this too, which I was thinking about the other day when I read Father Deacon's Quine paper. So, there's no, even if we wanted to say or think that there was some epistemic bootstrapping project that was possible, that we could achieve a kind of purely neutral, objective, raw impression of sense data, right? The idea that this could be done, first of all, we've kind of already shown isn't really possible on the empiricist starting point. But even if we did think that we could do like some version of this, let's give an example of something that is presupposed here that we may not have noticed that we're invalid in concluding. So let's say that we have an individual who is engaging in the touching of a chair, right? Touch this chair, baby. We have sense data impression number 1. Oh, I touched the chair, it was solid. And then sense data impression number 2, I moved my hand down the smooth back of the chair, and the place where your back rests is actually really smooth, and it's different. So sense data impression number 2, and then we have sense data impression number 3. I lifted the chair up, and it seemed to weigh 30 pounds, and so you've got this, what seems to be, you think, raw sense data impressions imprinting upon you from, right, this external object chair out here in the world. So here's the hand, here's your lusty hand thrusting at this chair, and then you think the chair is causally, right, imprinting this sense data upon you. Well, let's not even get into the fact that we don't know what a you is, right? What is this you that's receiving this sense data? Look at this invalid leap from this series of events here. I'm assuming that in this raw sense data number 1, that there was some meaningful impression from an object in the external world that is the same object in sense data impression number 2. But I don't know that. I've just assumed that. And the fact that one event temporally succeeded another event does not prove that it's the same object out there. Now you might say, well, you're being ridiculous. Nobody really thinks that it's different objects. Oh, really? But my point here is that to go from sense data impression number 1 to sense data impression number 2, as if there is a shared thing between 1 and 2, and yet at the same time, these are 2 distinct events, right? But I'm pulling out distinct properties from a single object. That's a non sequitur. In other words, I am doing pattern recognition, assuming that there's qualities and properties in this object, and that's going beyond the raw sense data that I was supposed to be just receiving. In other words, the raw data here, to assume that it has a pattern recognition status with the raw data here, is an invalid move. That's a leap. The sense data does not grant the leap from 1 to 2 or from 2 to 3, or that all of these 3 share some commonality. Do you see that?
There's no way to obtain knowledge or learn about the external world without assumptions.
Sure.
And so why could they not reverse that on us and say, well, how do you know? Blah, 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 blah,
bro, right. So all we're doing is showing that their empiricist starting point doesn't work. I'm not saying that there's no commonality between these events. There is. But I don't have the problem because I don't have their worldview. This is a problem for their worldview.
Right.
So they can't turn it on us because I would just say, well, I'm not an empiricist. So the problems aren't a problem for me because I believe in all these categories and metaphysical principles. You are saying that you don't believe in all these metaphysical things and these conclusions. You're saying that you can't validate these metaphysical claims, and then you're using all these metaphysical claims to even make a claim that there is a, quote, meaningful sense data impression. You can't. Okay. That's the point.
That makes sense. Yeah.
And remember what knowledge, kind of in the traditional sense, actually is. It's not just having a correct belief, a true belief, but having the justification for it.
Yeah.
So
we can justify it and they can't.
No.
Well, yeah. I mean, think about it. I mean, if they just say, "Oh, because I have these," how do I actually determine that my belief is true? In other words, what are my right reasons? Oh, just a set of further unjustified assumptions that I've just made up or that I can't defend. Like, well, how is that a justification? And if you're basing your arrival or ascent of that true belief based on a belief that's unjustified, then you don't have knowledge from your position. That's all we're pointing out. So we're not pointing out that your belief is about that there's external world, et cetera, is false. We're just saying from your assumptions and starting points, you're unjustified, and you can't actually assert that it is a true belief because you have no justification for it. That's all we're pointing out.
I'm not saying there's no knowledge. I'm saying on your position, there's no knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense.
Yeah, great questions.
All right, man. Thanks, man. God bless.
You too.